In essence, the game of tennis could be boiled down to a rather simple proposition. The objective of the game comes down to propelling the tennis ball back and forth within certain set boundaries, namely the tennis court. The ball has to be propelled not by throwing, pushing, dribbling, or rolling, but by way of striking it. The one who can sustain such activity the longest wins. Easier said than done. As it turns out, sustaining this activity is not such a simple proposition after all. For some mysterious reason, when it comes to a fuzzy yellow ball, precious few, even among those who do it for a living, to say nothing of the amateurs, seem to be capable of the confident, reliable, and graceful performances like these. At the same time, thousands upon thousands of people, all around the world, on a daily basis, routinely master all sorts of athletic skills, by far more complicated, demanding, and even dangerous to do than striking the tennis ball, under any circumstances, could ever be. How in the world could it be even possible that so many able-bodied, athletically gifted individuals, in spite of all the sweat, blood, and tears, find themselves unable to handle the tennis ball with an appropriate degree of consistency, reliability, and grace, or even manage to have some of their strokes, like the serve for example, to be permanently out to lunch? Doesn't every stroke depend on exactly the same laws of physics and the same set of mechanical principles? And aren't all the players trying to do exactly the same thing with the ball? If this is the case, shouldn't all the best ball strikers be looking exactly alike in their movements and postures? Then why do majority of players, aside from looking permanently constipated and extremely awkward, lack any other uniformity? Putting the variable factor of the athletic abilities aside for a moment, the question is, what in the world could make a simple and straightforward task of striking the ball so difficult to perform, that instead of crisp, effective, and elegant strokes, time and time again, we are treated to a spectacle of such awkward-looking, almost freakish convulsions, that it is painful to watch? The familiar excuse for such grotesque clumsiness, that it is something normal, that it cannot be helped, because each player has a unique style and so-called individuality, is pure hogwash. Comforting as such malarkey may sound to some ears, this is little more than a clever attempt at a cover-up, not having an idea what to do, or how to get there. Because, if it were true, and if people on the whole were helpless to overcome their individual quirks, for the sake of efficiency and common sense, then the displays of such truly amazing uniformity and grace would have been simply out of the question. In any trade or craft, grace, and effortlessness are the true hallmarks of proficiency, and awkwardness is the indication of just the opposite. So, all of these tortured grimaces are not the expression of individuality. They are clear signs of great physical discomfort, which grows from an ordinary inaptitude. The reason for such bizarre and dismal state of affairs is so deeply rooted that it is not at all easy to pin it down. Yet, it is paradoxically simple. In a nutshell, all these tennis players literally don't know what they are doing. To be exact, they are not quite clear on whether they are striking or throwing. Of course, such a provocative statement will require some kind of explanation. And it will have to be a mother of all explanations to make even a small dent in the defensive wall of general consensus which surrounds this issue. So, here it is. In our daily lives, the striking action would be rarely called for. Maybe only to kill a mosquito. All due to the untimely demise of the corporal punishment in schools. So it is only natural that on the whole, people don't give it much thought, and know either very little or absolutely nothing about the act of striking, what it should feel like, or how it works. Even the act of throwing, flawed and problematic as it commonly is, would be by far a more familiar proposition to most. As all creatures, people would naturally fear what they don't know or don't understand. For example, they will be afraid to ride a bicycle if they have never done it before, or will be afraid to go into the water if they haven't learned how to swim. Striking, rudimentary as it may look, is by no means an inborn skill, and believe it or not, just as walking, it requires learning and understanding. With the exception of a few proverbial black sheep, who inexplicably know exactly what to do from the time they are born. Most people, if left to their own devices, will shy away from it. For the vast majority, striking remains outside their familiar comfort zone, and, for them, it would be mainly associated with the destruction, violence, and lack of control. Paradoxically, though, it is the art of striking that, throughout our history, we had to rely on the most. And, as a species, probably owe our very survival to it. Tennis coaches, being of the people themselves, would also share this common mistrust of striking. And in their professional capacity, they bring it to the court with them. Instead of taking the training wheels off, so to speak, and encouraging their students to embrace striking and to learn harnessing what it has to offer, they avoid it as a plague, stoking the fear of striking with their silly instructions and reinforcing it with the help of all kinds of idiotic training aids. They will talk endlessly about brushing, carving, guiding, or holding the ball on the strings.
Kind of a massage effect that you're going to feel like you're massaging the ball.
And just practice rolling it for a little while, like that.
You're coming, brushing up the back of the ball with the wrist pronation coming left to right over the ball.
Everything under the sun, but never about simply striking it. Many, for example, would literally suggest slowing down the swing as the means of controlling the ball better.
But I want you to have faith that this is going to work, because I've tested this and I've noticed that when you actually slow your swing down at the right time, you gain more ball control.
So it shouldn't come as a big surprise that with all this helpful advice standing in your way, most players never confront and overcome this fear, and never learn to actually strike the ball. Instead, they are trying to treat the ball as if they were throwing it.
Develop that throwing motion. It's really going to pay off.
And with each practice session,
A little bit higher, just push it. You don't need to hit it, just push it over. Very good. Okay. All right, so the second part.
in every training device, they are driving this habit deeper and deeper. But it is physically impossible to throw, to push, or to massage a flying ball with a tennis racket. The ball can only be struck or deflected. And try as they may, they will end up accomplishing neither. Not able to throw the ball, and at the same time, not knowing how to strike it. Neither here nor there. What a pickle, I tell you, what a pickle. You would have to agree that not knowing much about what you are doing is not a recipe for getting good at doing it. And on the contrary, knowing as much as possible about the subject at hand and understanding all its details can only improve your chances of mastering this vital skill. So let's take it from the top. This is a throw. And this is a strike. In many respects, they would appear to be quite similar, and it is understandable how, based on that, one could be easily mistaken for another, and could even be thought of as one and the same. But such similarities are only skin deep. These are two fundamentally different processes which should never be confused. And here is why. In a throw, the force is applied to a stick, which takes the ball for a ride. And at some point along this ride, the ball gets released and continues on its own. In a strike, the force is also applied to the stick. But here, the ball does not go for any ride, but rather, it collides with that stick. And, at that very instant, it all becomes a completely different ballgame.
My name is Paul Furs, and I'm the head of Test Methods Development. Today, we've got a high-speed camera, and we're looking at driver impacts on a variety of balls and a variety of ball speeds. And we're doing that as a teaching point for videos to show people that even if you've got a lower driver speed, that you still compress the ball sufficiently. I gather there's talk out in the world that I don't swing hard enough to play the Pro V, or I don't swing hard enough to play the Pro V1X. Well, honestly, if you compare the 120 mile an hour driver speed to the 175 mile an hour driver speed, and you'll see that the compression on the ball is really quite similar. Today we're shooting 22,000 frames a second. That gives us about 10 or 12 individual frames of the ball on the club face. We've got an exposure time of 15 microseconds, which is a little bit long, but I wanted the images to be nice and bright. And we can look at the mechanics of how the ball impacts the club and how that translates into spin and speed and launch angle. The first time we did this, there were a bunch of things that the ball does that I really didn't expect. We did expect that the compressions would be similar. That was part of the point of going through this exercise, so that wasn't a real surprise. But when the club comes into the ball, ball's round, as best as I can do round with my fingers, the club comes into it, and this side of the ball goes flat. And there are 3 or 4 frames where the ball looks like a D, flat on this side and round here. And then right before it's done, the back side of the ball pulls in like that and then goes out. When it comes off the club face, the ball is actually longer. It's not round anymore. So it does, spring right off the club face. And it's one thing knowing that happens. It's a whole nother thing seeing it. It's really cool. It's a lot of fun.
In a throw, the acceleration of the ball is gradual and protracted. It is important to note here that the speed of the ball never exceeds the velocity of the throwing stick. But in a strike, on the other hand, something completely different takes place. The stick collides with the ball, and literally in a blink of an eye, something happens. The ball takes off and begins traveling in the opposite direction, outpacing the stick instantly. At this very moment, we begin dealing with a rather curious, and it is safe to say, a magical event, which is the collision of 2 bodies. Without getting too clinical about it, there are certain things about this event which must be pointed out, for no other reason than to make it clear that it has nothing in common with throwing. First of all, it is an autonomous event, meaning that the outcome of this event is determined strictly by the laws of conservation of energy and momentum, and thankfully not by a third party, such as the player, for example. As you can see for yourself, everything works like clockwork on its own. Second, the player's role or participation in a striking event is limited only to a timely delivery of the racket and its velocity to the point of impact. This contribution will be simply factored into the overall equation. Sorry, but wishful thinking or self-delusions of any kind will not. To some limited degree, the player can affect the ball's behavior, but only indirectly, through those variables which he contribute to the event. Other than that, the collision mechanism, which is set in motion at the moment of impact, is completely out of the player's hands, so to speak. And third, believing that, through some clever and timely racket manipulations, one would fully control the outcome of this event to his or her liking, is nothing but a pipe dream, which will never come true. No matter what kind of exotic pretzel you end up twisting yourself into. Also, one has to keep in mind that the delivery of adequate amount of racket velocity to the point of impact, time after time, is by no means an easy task, which could get quite tricky at times. So, it would make a great deal of sense if the players would get into a habit of doing it from a simple, comfortable, and well-anchored position, like Stan. Roger. or Justine, for example. Contorted and clumsy stances, like these, make it very difficult, if not impossible, executing this task with any degree of consistency or precision. So, when it comes to striking the ball, instead of daydreaming about brushing, carving, or massaging the ball, the player would be much better off focusing full-time on striking it. Interestingly enough, everything that is taught about ball striking these days, in one way or another, seems to be based either directly or indirectly on a single, false premise: that, during the stroke, the ball has a rather extended contact with the racket, that the ball will stay on the strings, by some accounts, for up to 8 milliseconds, during which time we are led to believe it could be redirected and otherwise manhandled. This idea is a pure fantasy, a classic case of an urban mythology, which most likely was originated by the early pioneers of tennis, golf, and baseball, and has never been revisited since. In all fairness, it is difficult to blame those guys for such blunders. They couldn't have known any better, because unlike their modern counterparts, their conclusions had to be based on their gut feelings, rather than any hard evidence. They simply lacked the appropriate tools, which would have allowed them to see what's really going on behind that blur. What occurs in reality is quite different, of course. After a brief contact with the ball, the player is left with a vibrating racket and a lingering sensation, which is very much akin to a feeling of a pinch, which, as we all know, could be felt long after the actual pinching is over. This phantom sensation is falsely interpreted as a proof positive of an extended contact with the ball, and it all begins going downhill from there. Based solely on this illusion, and no evidence to support any of the assertions, a great assortment of quote-unquote techniques have been concocted, and the whole generations of players were brought up on this poppycock. They were brainwashed into believing in such things as the follow-through, the acceleration through the ball, the pronation of the forearm, the snapping of the wrist, the windshield wipers, coiling and coiling, and God only knows what else. Anything but striking. Well, all of these so-called techniques will have just as much to do with the actual flight of the ball as the Santa Claus with the gifts under your Christmas tree. Since the only magic you will be dealing with on the tennis court would be the collision of two bodies, and the actual duration of the contact will last only as long as a photo flash, there will never be enough time-space continuum to put any of these elaborate, and I am quite sure, very clever rituals into practice. At the same time, any such machinations before as well as after the impact are completely useless, since there is no physical contact between the ball and the racket. So it seems that, no matter how you look at it, going through all these motions, and pretending that by doing it, you are affecting the ball in some constructive way, is a complete waste not only of your time, but your physical and mental resources as well. Believe it or not, but this little spot is pretty much all that you've got to hang your hat on. And if you intend to get any good at striking that ball, you'd better come down to earth, rethink your relationships with the ball, and start figuring out how to make the best of it. What can be done in order to impart the speed, the spin, and the direction onto the ball within the framework of reality. It would seem that in this day and age, with all of the evidence that we've got, the defective striking, as well as the poor throwing for that matter, could be eradicated like polio once and for all. Not so fast. As it turns out, the man's ability to learn and to make amazing discoveries is matched only by his capacity and his eagerness to believe in almost anything, including blatant absurdities. So, the various dog and pony shows, which spread the state of general confusion on this issue, continue to be churned out unabated.
Play with the racket, that this can happen in a split second. But if you have the right idea, it's gonna work. We want to push the ball first and then roll. This also teaches us that the contact is not very short, like in the first instance where we had a loose and short contact. That's the worst way of hitting a tennis ball. So we want to stay a little bit with the ball when we hit it. That's why we want to feel that we're like compressing the ball.
There are 5 key fundamental positions in the forehand. Number 1.
Sterling Hart, on the other hand, is already working on that top block very quickly up into the second springboard position and getting that top cut.
Change the plane. So now Sasha will do this in this plane. Right. So you want to compress and roll the ball. That's it. And after you will...
But Sterling Hart has such an advantage here. Only a few more cuts for Sterling Hart.
Then he goes and he does his open stance forehand. You can work on developing spin. You can work on developing your grip. You can work on hitting low balls.
Sterling Hart gets it in 43-33. What a great time for the young Canadian Brown. Still trying to get that top block done as he...
Look, I have the chair here and I'm going to show you. If I want to hit, down the line, I angle the racket that way. This is down the line, right that way. I want to play cross court. I hit the other way, a little bit farther. Okay. It has nothing to do with position of feet. Here, I want to keep my feet in the air. So down the line, a nice cross court shot now. See, has nothing to do with that. It's just the position. This side is his forehand. Like this. Here a few more. Look, like this, into that corner. Put it farther, make me run a little bit. Yeah, there you go. You go like this, and you get $20 million. So, the argument is, Oscar, don't beat me up. I'm not saying necessarily, but I've heard people say that.
Tennis is so simple, it's just unbelievable. Yeah. It's one of the easiest sports to play. And